the rumble of heavy machinery tearing through the peaceful morning of my 150-year-old ranch shattered more than just the silent. It ripped apart 3 generations of trust, sweat, and dreams that my family had poured into this sacred ground. Reggie Blackwell and her HOA cronies had just crossed a line that even the devil himself would think twice about. They'd turned the fertile soil that once fed half this county into their personal construction playground, calling it landscape improvement, like they were doing me some kind of favor. I'd been patient with their petty power games for too long, but this was the final straw. When I stepped out of my cabin empty-handed, they thought they'd already won. But a few seconds later, when I walked back out carrying something that made them all freeze, dead in the dusty air, metal glinting under the afternoon sun. Well, let's just say nobody expected what one wrong shovelful of dirt would cost the entire HOA. Tell me in the comments where you're watching this Loop Stories episode from, because what comes next will make you question if you're living in the real world. The screech of metal against stone jolted me awake at 6 hours in the morning, which wouldn't have been unusual, except for the fact that I hadn't scheduled any construction work on my property. Through the cabin's weathered windows, I could see a massive yellow excavator tearing through my cornfield like some prehistoric beast, its hydraulic arms scooping up chunks of earth that my great-grandfather had first plowed in 1874. The driver, a lean guy in a hard hat, who I'd later learn was named Tommy Rodriguez, worked the controls with practiced efficiency, completely oblivious to the fact that he was destroying heritage worth more than money, standing beside the machine like some kind of twisted construction. Foreman was Regina Blackwell, decked out in a crisp white business suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, her blonde bob catching the morning light as she barked orders into her phone. The sight of her on my land without permission sent a surge of anger through my chest. But I'd learned over the years that rushing into confrontation without understanding the full situation usually made things worse, not better. I pulled on my boots and stepped outside, the cool morning air mixing with the acrid smell of diesel, exhaust, and freshly turned earth. "Hey," I called out, my voice carrying across the field. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Tommy immediately shut off the excavator's engine, and the sudden silence felt almost as jarring as the noise had been. Reggie turned toward me with the kind of smile that politicians use when they're about to explain why raising taxes is good for you, her manicured hand clutching a manila folder thick with official-looking documents. "Good morning, Marcus," she said, using my full name, instead of Mac like everyone else in town did, which always felt like a power play designed to keep me at arm's length. "I hope we didn't wake you. But according to the new HOA landscape enhancement regulations, this area has been designated for immediate improvement." She gestured toward a freshly installed sign that I hadn't noticed the night before, its metal post driven deep into the ground that had been in my family for 3 generations. The sign read, "Sunset Valley HOA Community, Enhancement Zone," in bold letters that made my blood pressure spike immediately. "Enhancement Zone," I repeated, trying to keep my voice level, even though every instinct was telling me to start throwing punches. "This is private property, Reggie." "My private property. Your HOA doesn't have any jurisdiction here." But even as I said it, I could see the smug confidence in her eyes that told me she thought she had all the angles covered. She opened the manila folder with theatrical precision, pulling out what looked like a stack of legal documents, complete with official seals and signatures that probably meant about as much as monopoly money. "Marcus, if you'd bothered to read the emails we sent regarding the updated community bylaws, you'd know that this section of your property falls under our new territorial expansion guidelines," she said, waving the papers like they were some kind of magical proclamation that could override a century and a half of legal ownership. That's when I walked back into the cabin and returned, with something that made Reggie's face go as white as her expensive suit. It was a rolled-up piece of parchment that looked older than sin itself, complete with hand-drawn property lines and signatures in faded ink that predated the Civil War. "This," I said, unrolling the document carefully, "is the original land grant from 1974, signed by the territorial governor himself and registered with the Federal Land Office before this county even existed." The surveyor's marks and boundary descriptions were crystal clear, showing that not only did the HOA have no claim to my land, but their entire development had been built on property that technically still belonged to my family. Your fancy new regulations don't mean squat when they're trying to override federal land grants. Reggie. Tommy climbed down from the excavator, his face showing the kind of confusion that comes when you realize you might be digging yourself into legal trouble along with literal holes in the ground. But while I was busy enjoying the look of panic creeping across Reggie's face, her sister Ronnie was fumbling around with some papers of her own, and in her typical scattered fashion, she managed to drop a printed email that fluttered to the ground like a leaf. The header at the top read Phase 1 pond excavation and was dated 3 weeks earlier, which meant this whole emergency landscape enhancement story was complete. They'd been planning this invasion for weeks, probably months, and the timing of their morning assault was no accident. Interesting, I said, picking up the email and scanning its contents, which included detailed excavation plans and references to securing mineral rights that made my engineer's instincts start tingling with suspicion. Looks like you ladies have been busy plotting behind closed doors. Reggie's face went from white to red as she realized her sister had just handed me evidence of premeditation, and the way she grabbed the paper from my hands told me there was a lot more to this story than simple HOA overreach. Tommy wiped his hands on his jeans and looked back and forth between us like he was watching a tennis match where the stakes kept getting higher. "Look, Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice carrying the kind of apologetic tone that suggested he was starting to realize he'd been played. "They told me this was all legitimate, that you'd signed off on the pond installation, but just hadn't been properly notified about the timeline. The fact that they'd lied to him, too, just added another layer to whatever scheme Reggie was running, and I could see the wheels turning in his head as he started to piece together that he might be the fall guy in whatever legal nightmare was about to unfold. Reggie stepped between us with the aggressive posture of someone who'd been cornered but wasn't ready to give up the fight. "The legality of our actions isn't up for debate here," she snapped, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "We have proper authorization from the County Planning Commission, and if you continue to interfere with our scheduled improvements, we'll have no choice but to involve law enforcement." The threat of cops might have scared some people, but I'd spent enough years dealing with bureaucratic bullies to know that the loudest threats usually came from the weakest positions. Still, as I watched Reggie march back toward her white BMW with Ronnie scrambling behind her like a lost puppy, I couldn't shake the feeling that this morning's confrontation was just the opening move in a much bigger game. The way she'd mentioned the County Planning Commission, so specifically the prepared legal documents that looked a little too official, and most importantly, that dropped email about mineral rights, all suggested that someone had done their homework before launching this invasion. What I didn't know yet was just how deep this rabbit hole went, or how many people in positions of power might already be dancing to Reggie's tune. But as I stood there looking down at the hole Tommy had carved into my cornfield, something caught my eye that made my heart skip a beat and my engineering background start screaming. Warnings that would change everything about this fight, but I wasn't ready yet to let anyone know what that excavator had just accidentally uncovered, because some discoveries are too dangerous to reveal until you understand exactly who you're fighting and what they're after. I waited until the dust from Reggie's BMW settled before kneeling beside the excavation hole, my heart pounding as I examined what Tommy's machine had accidentally unearthed. The chunk of rock in my hand wasn't just any ordinary stone. It was speckled with metallic veins that I recognized immediately from my geology days, lithium ore, and from the looks of it, high-grade stuff that could be worth millions if there was enough of it underground. 20 years of working as a geological engineer before inheriting this ranch had taught me to spot valuable minerals, but I'd never expected to find them literally in my backyard. The irony wasn't lost on me that Reggie's greedy little excavation project had just stumbled onto exactly the kind of discovery that could fund my family's ranch for the next century, assuming I could keep it away from people who'd killed to get their hands on it. I carefully wrapped the sample in my handkerchief and slipped it into my jacket pocket, making sure to smooth over the dirt where I'd been digging so nobody else would notice what the excavator had revealed. My first call was to Judge William Hendricks, a crusty old-timer who'd been my grandfather's, drinking buddy and the closest thing to legal counsel I could trust in this town. Bill had retired from the bench 5 years ago, but his mind was still sharp as a tack when it came to property law and local politics. Plus, he owed my family enough favors to fill a pickup truck. "Mac, you sound rattled," he said after I'd explained the morning's events, his growly voice carrying the kind of concern that comes from decades of watching good people get screwed by bad systems. Reggie Blackwell's been making moves around town lately, throwing money at anyone with a vote or a signature stamp. And I've been wondering when she'd make her play for your land. The way he said it made my stomach drop, because it suggested that this morning's invasion wasn't some spur-of-the-moment power grab, but part of a larger strategy that had been months or maybe years in the making. "What kind of moves?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew the answer. Bill's heavy sigh told me everything I needed to know before he even started talking. The kind that involve campaign contributions to county commissioners and mysterious consulting contracts for their family members, he said, his voice taking on the bitter tone of someone who'd watched corruption eat away at institutions he'd spent his life trying to protect. Word around the courthouse is that Reggie's real estate development company has been buying up influence faster than she's been buying up land, and 3 out of 5 commissioners are now dancing to whatever tune she's playing. The revelation hit me like a punch to the gut because it meant that the county planning commission authorization she'd mentioned wasn't just bureaucratic posturing, but potentially legitimate. Bought and paid for with dirty money that most people would never be able to trace. Tommy had been standing awkwardly by his excavator this whole time, clearly wanting to leave but not sure if he was allowed to. And I could see the guilt eating away at him as he realized he'd been used as a pawn in someone else's chess game. "Mr. Thorne, I swear I didn't know they were lying to me," he said, his voice carrying the kind of desperation that comes when a working man realizes he might lose his job over something that wasn't his fault. "They showed me permits, told me you'd signed off on everything. Even paid me double my usual rate to get started first thing this morning." The mention of double pay made my radar go off because nobody throws around extra money unless they're either desperate or trying to buy silence. And in this case, it was probably both. I told him not to worry about it, that he was as much a victim in this as I was. But I also made a mental note to keep him close because his testimony about Reggie's deception might be crucial if this thing ended up in court. That's when Reggie's white BMW came roaring back up my driveway, this time accompanied by a black SUV that looked like it belonged to either federal agents or people pretending to be federal agents. 2 guys in suits climbed out of the SUV, both wearing the kind of cheap sunglasses and generic business attire that screamed hired muscle pretending to be professionals. And I could tell immediately that Reggie had decided to escalate this confrontation beyond anything I'd been prepared for. "Mr. Thorne," she called out, her voice now carrying the artificial sweetness of someone who thinks they hold all the cards. "These gentlemen are here to ensure that our property improvement project proceeds without further interference." The taller of the 2 men stepped forward with a clipboard full of official-looking documents, but something about his posture and the way his jacket hung told me he was carrying more than just paperwork under that suit. According to County Resolution 847B, passed last month by emergency vote, this area has been designated as blighted property requiring immediate remediation, the man said, reading from his clipboard like he was reciting a shopping list. "You have 24 hours to vacate the premises or face legal consequences for obstruction of public improvement projects." The whole thing was so obviously a setup that it would have been funny if it weren't so dangerous. But what caught my attention was Ronnie standing behind her sister, fidgeting with her phone and looking like she wanted to be anywhere else in the world, when she accidentally knocked her purse off her shoulder, spilling its contents across my driveway. I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A business card for Morrison Geological Survey, the same company that had been doing mineral assessments for mining companies across 3 states. But I wasn't ready to show my hand yet, especially not with Reggie's hired goons breathing down my neck and the memory of that lithium or sample burning a hole in my pocket. Instead, I calmly told I'd need to review their paperwork with my attorney before agreeing to anything, which seemed to frustrate Reggie, but didn't surprise her. 24 hours, Mr. Thorne, she repeated, climbing back into her BMW with a kind of dramatic flair that suggested she thought she was starring in her soap opera. After that, we'll be forced to take more direct action. As their vehicles disappeared down my driveway, leaving me alone with Tommy and a hole in my cornfield that had just revealed more secrets than any of us were prepared to handle. I realized that the next 24 hours would determine whether I'd be able to protect my family's legacy or lose everything to a woman who'd been planning this takeover for longer than I'd imagined. But what none of them knew was that while they'd been busy plotting my downfall, they'd accidentally handed me the one thing that could turn this entire situation on its head, assuming I could figure out how to use it before they figured out what they'd uncovered. The sound of gravel crunching under heavy tires at dawn told me that my 24-hour grace period had just been cut short by about 18 hours. Through my bedroom window, I could see the distinctive black and white pattern of a sheriff's department cruiser, its red and blue lights painting my cabin walls in alternating colors that made my stomach clench with dread. Deputy Jake Morrison climbed out of the driver's seat with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who didn't want to be doing whatever he was about to do, his hand resting on a folded piece of paper that I already knew would contain some kind of legal nightmare designed to make my life infinitely more complicated. Jake had been a decent kid growing up, the son of one of the miners who'd worked the old copper claims before they played out, and seeing him walking toward my door with that grim expression told me that Reggie's influence had spread even deeper into the local power structure than Judge Bill had warned me about. "Morning, Mac," Jake said when I opened the door, his voice carrying the kind of professional politeness that cops use when they're about to ruin your day but don't particularly want to. "I've got a search warrant here for your property, specifically relating to allegations of threatening behavior with a deadly weapon." He handed me the folded paper with obvious reluctance, and I could see in his eyes that he knew this whole thing stank worse than a dead fish in August heat. The warrant was signed by Judge Patricia Kellerman, a recent appointment to the bench, who'd won her election with significant financial backing from what the local newspaper had diplomatically called business interests. Though everyone in town knew, that meant whoever had the deepest pockets and the least scruples. According to the complaint filed yesterday evening, you allegedly brandished a shotgun at members of the Sunset Valley Homeowners Association and made verbal threats against their safety. The accusation was so ridiculous that I almost laughed, except that laughing at a search warrant rarely improves the situation. "Jake, you know me better than that," I said, stepping aside to let him into the cabin because fighting a legal search would only make things worse. "When exactly am I supposed to have done this threatening?" He pulled out a small notebook and flipped through a few pages, his expression growing more uncomfortable with each detail he had to recite. "Yesterday morning, approximately 8:15 a.m., during an altercation over property improvements," he read, though his tone suggested he was having trouble believing the words coming out of his mouth. "The complainant states that you became increasingly agitated and eventually retrieved a firearm from your residents, using it to intimidate them into leaving your property. I had to give Reggie credit for creativity, because she'd managed to take a completely fabricated story and wrap it in just enough truth to make it sound plausible to anyone who hadn't been there." Jake conducted his search with professional thoroughness but obvious distaste, methodically checking my gun cabinet and finding exactly what any reasonable person would expect to find in a rural home: a legally owned shotgun with proper registration and ammunition stored separately in compliance with state regulations. "I have to take this as evidence," he said apologetically, placing my grandfather's old Remington 870 into a plastic evidence bag like it were contaminated with something contagious. "You'll get it back once this gets sorted out, assuming no charges are filed." But while he was documenting serial numbers and filling out paperwork, his eyes caught something that made him pause and look at me with a completely different expression. Sitting on my kitchen table, partially wrapped in the handkerchief where I'd left it the night before, was the chunk of lithium ore that Tommy's excavator had uncovered, its metallic veins catching the morning light in a way that any experienced miner's son would immediately recognize. "Jesus, Mac," Jake whispered, glancing toward the door, to make sure we weren't being overheard. My dad worked the mines for 30 years before they shut down, and I know valuable ore when I see it. That piece right there could be worth more than most people make in a year, depending on what's underneath it. The connection hit him immediately, the same way it had hit me when I'd first seen the Morrison Geological Survey business card fall out of Ronnie's purse. This whole thing isn't about HOA regulations or landscape improvements, is it? I nodded grimly, confirming what we were both thinking but couldn't say out loud. Reggie hadn't stumbled onto my property by accident. She'd been targeting it specifically because she knew what was buried here, and her elaborate legal maneuvering was just a smokescreen to cover up what amounted to an attempted mineral rights theft on a massive scale. That's when we heard car doors slamming outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of Ronnie's voice live streaming another one of her social media updates to whatever unfortunate souls followed her. Digital drama. OMG, you guys. We're here at the dangerous rancher's house where the police are searching for weapons right now, she was saying, her voice carrying that artificial excitement that influencers use when they're pretending their staged content is spontaneous. Through the window, I could see her pointing her phone at Jake's patrol car while a small crowd of what looked like HOA supporters gathered behind her, probably recruited with promises of appearing in her viral content. This is what happens when entitled property owners think they can threaten innocent community volunteers who are just trying to make our neighborhood safer and more beautiful. But just as Jake was about to head outside and disperse the crowd, my phone rang with a call from Sarah Chen, the property rights attorney that Judge Bill had recommended I contact immediately. Mac, don't say anything to anyone until I get there, she said, her voice carrying the kind of urgency that suggested she'd already heard about the search warrant through whatever network lawyers used to keep track of legal emergencies. I've been reviewing the documentation that was filed against you, and there are procedural irregularities that suggest this whole thing was rushed through the system faster than normal protocols would allow. The implication was clear. Someone with significant influence had been pulling strings to accelerate this legal attack, and the speed of the process had left cracks in their story that a competent attorney might be able to exploit. 20 minutes later, Sarah's silver Honda pulled into my driveway. Just as Jake was finishing his search and trying to convince Ronnie to stop filming his every movement, Sarah Chen was exactly the kind of lawyer you'd want in your corner during a property dispute. Sharp, thorough, and completely immune to intimidation tactics that worked on people who hadn't spent years dealing with land grabbers and corrupt officials. She immediately demanded to see the search warrant, studied it with the intensity of a jeweler examining a diamond, and then asked Jake a series of pointed questions about the timeline and authorization, process that made him increasingly uncomfortable. This warrant was issued less than 12 hours after the complaint was filed. She noted her voice, taking on the prosecutorial tone that had probably made opposing counsel very nervous during her previous career. That's unusually fast for a non-emergency situation, especially considering that the alleged incident occurred more than 24 hours before the complaint was submitted. What caught her attention, though, was a small detail that would have been easy to miss. The fax header on one of the supporting documents showed it had been sent from Morrison Geological Survey to the courthouse at 3:47 a.m., more than 5 hours before Reggie had officially filed her complaint. Either someone has a very unusual schedule for sending routine paperwork, Sarah said with the kind of smile that suggested she'd just found the loose thread that would unravel this entire scheme, or we're looking at evidence that this whole legal action was coordinated in advance with parties who had access to geological survey information about your property. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Not only had Reggie been planning this attack for weeks or months, but she'd been working with professional mineral assessors who'd probably been mapping my land without permission. And now we had documentation that proved the conspiracy extended far beyond simple HOA overreach into the realm of criminal fraud and mineral rights theft. The headline on the local television news that evening made my blood boil. Local rancher under investigation for threatening community volunteers. Channel 7's Perky Blonde anchor delivered the story with the kind of breathless sensationalism that turns complex property disputes into simple Good versus evil narratives complete, with stock footage of my ranch and a carefully edited interview with Reggie that made her sound like a concerned citizen rather than a scheming land grabber. Mrs. Blackwell says she fears for her safety and the safety of other HOA members who are simply trying to improve their community. The anchor reported, her voice dripping with the kind of sympathy usually reserved for natural disaster victims. The story conveniently left out any mention of excavators tearing through my cornfield or the suspicious timing of geological surveys, instead painting me as an unhinged property owner who'd snapped under the pressure of reasonable community standards. By the time the story finished airing, my phone was buzzing with calls from neighbors who'd known my family for decades, but were now questioning whether they knew me at all. Old Mrs. Henderson from down the road asked if I needed professional help dealing with my anger issues, while Bob Martinez from the feed store wondered aloud whether maybe the HOA folks had a point about property maintenance standards. The speed with which public opinion turned against me was both impressive and terrifying. A masterclass in how quickly a well-crafted narrative could override years of community, relationships, and personal reputation. Even worse, I could see the uncertainty in people's eyes when they looked at me. That subtle shift that happens when someone starts wondering if the person they thought they knew might be capable of the things they're being accused of. Sarah Chen had spent the morning at the county records office methodically, reviewing every document related to Reggie's various property claims and development permits. And what she discovered made the evening news story seem like a minor annoyance compared to the larger fraud we were uncovering, the deed of trust that the HOA is using to justify their territorial expansion was filed in 2019, she explained during our meeting at her office, spreading photocopies across her desk like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that revealed an increasingly ugly picture. But when I compared it to the original surveyors, maps from the 1972, the property boundaries don't match. Someone has been systematically altering legal descriptions to include land that was never part of the original HOA developed. The implications were staggering. If Sarah was right, then Reggie hadn't just been planning to steal my land. She'd been stealing from multiple property owners for years, using forged documents and corrupted officials to legitimize what amounted to the largest land grab in county history. What made the situation even more complicated was the mysterious disappearance of several key documents from the county archives, gaps in the official record that corresponded exactly with the properties that Reggie's company had acquired over the past 5 years. It's like someone went through the files with surgical precision, Sarah noted, pointing to a list of missing deeds and survey reports that would have exposed the fraud if anyone had thought to look for them. Whoever did this had inside knowledge of the filing system and probably access to the building after hours. The level of coordination required for this kind of systematic document theft suggested that Reggie's operation was far more sophisticated than a simple case of HOA overreach involving multiple conspirators with access to government, buildings, and official records that most people would never be able to touch. That's when I decided it was time to bring in reinforcement in the form of Pete Bulldog Murphy, a retired private investigator who'd helped my grandfather track down cattle rustlers back in the 19992 and had never met a mystery he couldn't solve given enough time and coffee. Pete was pushing 70 but still had the instincts of a bloodhound and the patience of a saint when it came to following paper trails and surveillance work that would bore most people to tears. Your lady friend Reggie has been busy, he reported after spending 2 days conducting what he euphemistically called background research on our primary antagonist. She's got a record in Arizona for real estate fraud, served 18 months in minimum security, before the conviction got overturned on a technicality. Same pattern as what you're dealing with here. Target rural properties with unclear boundaries. Use forged documents to establish false claims. Then pressure the real owners into selling cheap or abandoning their land entirely. But Pete's most interesting discovery came from monitoring Reggie's phone calls using equipment that he assured me was completely legal for private investigation purposes, though I suspected the definition of legal might be somewhat flexible depending on who was asking. She's been talking to someone called Morrison at least twice a day for the past week, Pete explained, showing me a log of call times and durations. that painted a picture of increasingly frantic coordination between conspirators. Based on the conversation patterns and the timing, I'd say they're planning to move some kind of merchandise in the next few days, probably before anyone figures out what they've been up to. The mention of Morrison immediately connected to the geological survey business card that had fallen out of Ronnie's purse, suggesting that the mineral assessment of my property wasn't just preliminary research, but preparation for actual extraction and transport of whatever valuable materials they'd identified underground. The breakthrough came when Pete managed to intercept a conversation between Reggie and her mysterious contact that revealed the true scope of their operation. "They're not just after your lithium," he reported, his voice carrying the kind of grim satisfaction that comes from solving a puzzle that's been bothering you for days. "They've been systematically mapping mineral deposits across the entire county, using fraudulent property claims to gain access to land they don't own, then extracting valuable materials and selling them through shell companies that can't be traced back to the original theft. The operation was sophisticated enough to include legitimate-looking export permits and transportation contract, creating a paper trail that would fool casual inspection, while generating millions of dollars in revenue from stolen natural resources. What made the situation even more urgent was Pete's discovery that Reggie had been scheduling what she called cleanup operations for properties, where the mineral extraction had been completed, which in practical terms meant destroying evidence of illegal mining activity and making it impossible for the real property owners to prove what had been stolen. "According to the conversation I recorded yesterday, your place is next on the cleanup list," Pete warned, his expression growing more serious as he explained what cleanup probably entailed. "She's planning to eliminate any evidence that they've been conducting unauthorized geological surveys on your land, which means destroying core samples, survey equipment, and probably anything else that could connect them to the mineral theft." The implication was clear. If we didn't act fast, not only would I lose the lithium deposits under my property, but I'd also lose any chance of proving that they'd been stolen in the first place, leaving me with nothing but worthless land and a reputation, destroyed by false accusations that I'd never be able to overcome. But what Pete discovered next made everything else seem like a minor inconvenience compared to the real danger that was heading my way like a freight train with no brakes. Pete's phone call at 3 hours in the morning carried the kind of urgency that makes your blood turn to ice water before you're even fully awake. "Mac, they're coming for you tonight," he said, his voice tight with the controlled panic of someone who just overheard something that changed everything. "I've been monitoring their communications, and Reggie's people are planning to torch your cabin and make it look like an electrical fire, then plant evidence to frame you for insurance fraud, while they clean out whatever's left of the mineral deposits." The plan was diabolically simple in its effectiveness: destroy any evidence of their illegal mining operation while simultaneously eliminating me as a witness and discrediting my testimony by making me look like a desperate criminal who'd burned down his property for money. "How long do I have?" I asked, already pulling on my clothes and trying to think through the logistics of defending my home against arsonists, who probably had law enforcement in their pocket. "Maybe 6 hours, probably less," Pete replied, and I could hear him moving around on his end of the call, gathering equipment and preparing for what would essentially be a private war fought on my property. "I'm heading your way with surveillance gear and backup communication equipment, but you need to call Deputy Morrison right now and get official protection before they arrive." The irony of calling the same cop who'd searched my house yesterday wasn't lost on me. But Jake had seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the whole situation, and his father's mining background meant he understood what we were fighting for better than most people in law enforcement. "Tell him to bring friends and come prepared for a long night, because these people aren't going to back down easily when they realize their whole operation is about to be exposed." I was just finishing my call to Jake when headlights swept across my windows. But instead of the aggressive high beams I'd been expecting from Reggie's crew, it was Ronnie's beat-up Honda Civic, creeping up my driveway like she was afraid of waking the dead. She climbed out of the car looking like she hadn't slept in days, her usual social media confidence replaced by the kind of desperate fear that comes when you realize you've been swimming with sharks and forgot you're made of meat. "Mac, I need to warn you about something," she said when I opened the door, her voice shaking with emotion that seemed too genuine to be another one of her sister's elaborate performances. "Reggie's lost her mind. She's hired people from out of state, real criminals, and they're planning to do more than just steal your minerals." The story that tumbled out of Ronnie's mouth over the next 20 minutes painted a picture of a conspiracy that went far beyond anything I'd imagined, even after Pete's investigations had revealed the scope of Reggie's mineral theft operation. "She's been planning this for 2 years, Ronnie explained, pulling out her phone to show me screenshots of text messages and emails that documented a level of criminal coordination that belonged in a federal investigation rather than a local property dispute. The whole HOA thing was just a cover for a mining operation that's been stealing from properties across 3 counties. And when landowners started asking questions, they didn't just get sued or intimidated. They got framed for crimes or had accidents that made them disappear." The casual way she mentioned people disappearing made my skin crawl because it suggested that whatever was coming my way tonight might be permanent rather than just destructive. But the real bombshell came when Ronnie revealed that Reggie's crew wasn't just planning to burn down my cabin. They were going to plant drugs and illegal weapons to make it look like I'd been running some kind of criminal operation that had gone wrong. "She's got cocaine, illegal, firearms, even fake explosives that are supposed to make it look like you were planning to blow up the HOA offices," Ronnie said, her voice breaking as she realized how deep into criminal territory her sister had dragged her. "I thought we were just going to scare you into selling, maybe make some money from the mineral rights, but this is attempted murder and federal weapons charges, and I can't be part of it anymore." The transformation from annoying social media personality to terrified accomplice seeking redemption was so complete that I almost felt sorry for her until I remembered that her live streams and publicity stunts had helped create the public narrative that was now being used to justify my destruction. Jake arrived with backup just as Pete was finishing the installation of hidden cameras around my property, creating a surveillance network that would document whatever happened next with courtroom quality evidence that even corrupt officials would have trouble explaining away. "I brought Agent Torres from the state police," Jake said, introducing a sharp-eyed woman in tactical gear, who looked like she'd been hoping for exactly this kind of case to cross her desk. "Turns out your situation isn't unique. We've been tracking similar mineral theft operations across the region, and Mrs. Blackwell's name has come up in several ongoing investigations. The revelation that this was part of a larger federal case gave me hope that we might have enough firepower to fight back against whatever Reggie was planning. But it also meant that the stakes had just gotten exponentially higher for everyone involved. The trap we set was elegant in its simplicity. Let them come. Let them plant their evidence. Let them start their fire and document every second of it with equipment that would provide ironclad proof of conspiracy to commit arson, evidence tampering, and federal weapons violations. The key is to let them commit to the crime before we intervene," Agent Torres explained as we positioned ourselves around the property. "If we stop them too early, their lawyers will claim it was all just preparation for legitimate business activities. But once they start the fire and plant the drugs, we've got them on charges that carry decades in federal prison." What we didn't expect was how quickly the night would spiral into chaos, or how many secrets would be revealed when the people involved realized they were fighting for their freedom rather than just their profits. As we watched the first of Reggie's vehicles creep up the access road with their headlights turned off, I couldn't help but think about my grandfather's stories of defending this land against cattle rustlers and claim jumpers who thought they could take what belonged to his family. The tools and tactics had changed over the generations, but the fundamental battle remained the same. Honest people protecting what they'd earned against criminals who thought they could steal whatever they wanted, as long as they had enough money and influence to corrupt the system. But what none of us realized as we prepared for what we thought would be a straightforward case of catching arsonists in the act was that Reggie's operation was about to collapse in ways that would surprise everyone involved, starting with the person we least expected to turn against her. "I'm Ryan Carter, currently living in San Diego," California, and I'm a scriptwriter for the Loop Stories channel. This work still has many shortcomings, and I hope viewers will provide feedback in the comment section below. The black SUV that rolled up my driveway at 4 a.m. wasn't part of Reggie's usual crew. Agent Torres had been monitoring police radio frequencies all night, and what she'd discovered made our carefully planned surveillance operation seemed like child's play compared to the federal task force that had been tracking Reggie's mineral theft ring across 12 states. Mac, this just became a lot bigger than property fraud, she whispered through her radio earpiece, her voice carrying the kind of excitement that federal agents get when a small-town case explodes into career-making territory. We've got FBI units moving into position around your property right now, and what we're about to witness is the take-on of a criminal organization that's been stealing millions of dollars worth of natural resources from private landowners across the entire western United States. The timing couldn't have been more perfect because Reggie's cleanup crew had just started unloading equipment that looked more like military hardware than anything you'd expect to see at a property dispute. Through Pete's night vision cameras, we could see men in tactical gear setting up what appeared to be explosive charges around the foundation of my cabin, while others were preparing to plant evidence bags that probably contained enough illegal substances to put me away for life. But what caught our attention was the arrival of someone claiming to be a federal marshal with paperwork, authorizing the immediate seizure of my property as part of an ongoing criminal investigation, complete with official seals and signatures that would have fooled anyone who wasn't expecting them. That's when I made my entrance, stepping out of the cabin empty-handed with my arms visible, playing the role of a defeated property owner who'd finally accepted that he was outgunned and outmaneuvered by forces beyond his control. "Gentlemen, I assume you're here about the mineral rights dispute," I called out, walking slowly toward the group of men who'd frozen in place when they realized they'd been spotted in the middle of their evidence-planting operation. The fake marshal stepped forward with his clipboard of forged documents, probably expecting me to either run or fight, but not expecting me to calmly announce that I needed to retrieve something from inside the cabin before we proceeded with whatever legal theater they had planned. "Just need to get the keys to my safe," I explained, turning back toward the cabin with movements deliberate enough to avoid triggering any nervous responses from people who were clearly armed and increasingly jumpy about the direction this confrontation was taking. What I retrieved was my grandfather's shotgun that Jake had returned earlier that evening, along with a written apology for the procedural error that had led to its confiscation. But more importantly, I also grabbed the heavy steel lockbox that contained every piece of evidence we'd gathered about Reggie's operation, plus the lithium ore samples that had started this entire nightmare. When I walked back outside carrying both the shotgun and the lockbox, the effect on Reggie's crew was exactly what Agent Torres had predicted. They froze like deer in headlights, unsure whether they were looking at a man making his last stand or walking into some kind of trap that they hadn't anticipated. "See, the thing about mineral rights is that they're only valuable if you own the land there," I said conversationally, setting the lockbox down in the dusty area where Tommy's excavator had first broken ground and revealed the ore deposits that had triggered this entire conflict. And it turns out that determining ownership gets a lot more complicated when you're dealing with federal crimes. That's when the night exploded into chaos in ways that none of us had fully prepared for. FBI agents emerged from positions around my property like ghosts materializing out of darkness, their tactical lights and laser sights creating a light show that turned my ranch into something resembling a movie set. But the real surprise came from Ronnie, who stepped out from behind Agent Torres with a wireless microphone and an expression of determination that I'd never seen on her face before. "Reggie, I can't protect you anymore," she announced, her voice carrying across the property with amplification that ensured everyone present could hear every word. "These FBI agents, they know everything about Morrison Geological, about the forged deeds, about the people who disappeared when they asked too many questions about missing mineral surveys." The look of absolute betrayal on Reggie's face when she realized her sister was wearing a wire and had been cooperating with federal investigators was almost worth the months of harassment and legal threats I'd endured. "You recorded our conversations?" Reggie screamed, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the pressure of seeing her entire criminal empire collapse in real time. Everything we talked about in private, you've been feeding to the FBI. But Ronnie wasn't finished with her revelations. And what she said next made everyone present understand that this case was about to make national headlines for all the wrong reasons. I gave them the USB drive with all your emails from the past 2 years. Ronnie continued, her voice growing stronger as she realized that telling the truth was liberating rather than terrifying. The contracts with Morrison Geological, the payments to county commissioners, the threat letters you sent to property owners who wouldn't sell, and the insurance policies you took out on buildings, right? Before they mysteriously burned down. The systematic nature of the evidence she'd provided painted a picture of criminal conspiracy that went far beyond simple mineral theft into territory that would require federal prosecutors and probably congressional hearings to fully unravel. As FBI agents moved in to arrest Reggie and her crew, I opened the lockbox and pulled out the original land grant documents that proved not only did I own the mineral rights under my property, but according to 19th century survey maps that had been conveniently lost from county records, my family's original land grant extended to include most of the area where the Sunset Valley HOA had been built. The implications were staggering. For decades, homeowners had been paying mortgages and property taxes on land that legally belonged to my family, while Reggie had been collecting HOA fees and mineral rights payments for resources she'd never had any legal claim to extract. But as Agent Torres began reading Reggie, her rights and the fake marshal turned out to be wanted on federal warrants in 3 other states. I realized that this night had revealed something that would change not just my life, but the entire legal and economic structure of our county in ways that none of us had anticipated. Agent Torres spread the geological survey reports across my kitchen table like pieces of a massive puzzle that had taken federal investigators 2 years to assemble. And what they revealed made my head spin with implications that reached far beyond simple property fraud. According to the FBI's Mineral Resources Division, your sister-in-law wasn't just running a local scam, she explained to Ronnie, who was now sitting at my table wearing an FBI witness protection vest and looking like she'd aged 10 years in the past 6 hours. This was part of a coordinated effort to steal lithium deposits across the Western United States using forged documents and corrupted local officials to legitimize what amounts to the largest mineral theft operation in American history. The scope of Reggie's criminal enterprise was staggering. Over 40 properties in 12 states, hundreds of millions of dollars in stolen natural resources, and a network of accomplices that included county commissioners, state legislators, and federal land management officials who'd been systematically betraying public trust for private profit. But the document that really changed everything was a yellowed survey map from 1874 that the FBI had recovered from Reggie's personal safe, along with modern geological reports that showed she'd known exactly what she was targeting. When she'd launched her assault on my property, your great-grandfather's original land grant wasn't just for the 160 acres where your cabin sits, Agent Torres explained, pointing to boundary markers that had been deliberately obscured by decades of fraudulent property transfers and municipal annexations. According to federal territorial records, the Thorne family was granted mineral rights to a section of land that includes not just your ranch, but the entire area where Sunset Valley HOA was developed in the 1182nd. The legal ramifications were mind-boggling. Every house in the subdivision, every road and utility line, every swimming pool and tennis court had been built on land that my family had never sold, never transferred, and never relinquished legal claim to. The emotional impact of this revelation hit me like a freight train carrying 150 years of family history that I'd never fully understood. For 30 years since inheriting the ranch, I'd believed that my grandfather had been forced to sell most of our ancestral land to pay off debts and taxes, leaving me with just a small cabin and enough acreage to property lines and territorial governor's signature. I realized that grandfather hadn't lost our land at all. He'd been protecting it the only way he knew how, by allowing local development. That would make it impossible for large corporations to claim the property was unused or abandoned, while carefully preserving the legal documentation that proved our family's rightful ownership of mineral rights that were now worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Walking over to the old trunk where my grandfather had kept his important papers, I found something that made Agent Torres whistle with amazement. A leather-bound journal filled with detailed notes about geological surveys, mineral assessments, and legal strategies that showed my grandfather had been fighting the same kind of resource theft 40 years ago that I was dealing with today. The final entry, dated just weeks before his death, read, like a message intended specifically for this moment. If anyone tries to take what belongs to our family, remember that the truth is always buried right under their feet. You just have to know how to dig in the right place. He'd known about the lithium deposits since the 1982nd, had documented every attempt by outside interests to steal our mineral rights, and had spent decades building a legal fortress that would protect future generations of our family from exactly the kind of systematic theft that Reggie had been attempting. The resolution came faster than anyone expected, largely because the federal case against Reggie's organization was so overwhelming that plea bargaining became her only option for avoiding life in prison. She received 15 years in federal custody, plus restitution payments that would fund environmental restoration of damaged properties and compensation for families whose land had been illegally mined. The county commissioners, who'd been taking her bribes, faced their federal charges, while the fake geological survey company was shut down and its assets seized to help pay for the massive cleanup operation required to repair decades of environmental damage caused by illegal mining operations. But the most satisfying part of the whole resolution was watching the Sunset Valley HOA dissolve itself rather than face the legal nightmare of defending property claims on land they'd never legally own. I didn't evict anyone or demand immediate payment for decades of unauthorized occupancy. Instead, I offered each homeowner the opportunity to purchase their property at fair market value using proceeds from the legitimate lithium mining operation that would now fund both my family's future and the economic development of our entire community. 6 months later, standing in the garden where Reggie had once ordered Tommy to dig her fraudulent fish pond, I planted sunflowers like my grandmother had grown 60 years ago, while the sound of legitimate mining equipment hummed peacefully in the distance, creating jobs for 200 local families and generating revenue that would support our community for generations. Sometimes justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about discovering that the truth was there all along, waiting patiently underground for someone with the courage to dig it up. Have you ever felt powerless against corrupt authorities or greedy neighbors who think they can steal what's rightfully yours? Mac's story proves that with patience, evidence, and the right allies, even ordinary people can expose massive conspiracies and reclaim their heritage. These real-life justice stories show you're not alone in fighting unfair system. If Mac's victory against the HOA gave you hope that truth still wins, smash that like button and subscribe to Stories for more incredible tales where underdogs defeat corruption and protect what matters most.